one of the first things we have to understand is that 60% of weapons being used on the battlefield now are indigenously produced by Ukraine. And Ukraine's ability to have expanded the deep battle in terms of their own weaponry has been extreme. So one of the strikes overnight was by the Neptune cruise missile, a Ukrainian missile, which was converted from a naval missile into a land missile. We've also heard rumours of the Flamingo, which can fly potentially in testing up to 3,000 kilometres. So they're expanding the envelope, which is what has allowed them to take out something like 13 out of the 40 of the Russian oil refineries. The crucial thing about Tomahawk and actually the German Taurus missile is their ability to evade electronic jamming and their sophistication, which means that there's a circular error of probability. Hitting a target where you want to hit a target at long range is there for the future.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Chip Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command and author of the book Notes from a Small Military. Chip, welcome back.
Good afternoon, Louis.
Well, we've seen some pretty dramatic strikes on Kiev over the weekend. What message do you think Russia is trying to send with these after what we saw out of the US last week?
Well, I think Russia is just continuing its deep battle to try and sap the will of the Ukrainian people. It's absolutely certain, I think, at the moment that, how wars win, there's sort of three parts of that. The first one, decisive military ops, that's unlikely to be seen with a decisive operational breakthrough for both sides at the moment. The improbability of military victory, that's probably more likely at the moment. Well, the third reason why wars end is because of the cost to a country, either in demographic infrastructure terms or economic terms or in terms of their will. So it's a mixture of both the economic damage, the infrastructure damage, and the damage to the will. But I don't think it's going to do that for the Ukrainian people, because it's always been the case that this is a war of choice for Russia. It is the aggressor, and it's a war of necessity for Ukraine. Ukraine's sovereignty would cease to exist if Russia were to allow it to succeed. And because the tempo, actually, of Russian operations, or Russian drone strikes and ballistic missile strikes is, although it's heavier, it's not day after day after day. And that respite you get from that is one of the things that was learnt in the Blitz, that you can recover quite quickly. So although the infrastructure damage may be getting greater, the number of people actually being killed is not significant in terms of what you would have seen in the Blitz on Coventry or Plymouth or Bristol or Liverpool or Belfast. So I think the Ukrainians can endure these sort of things as long as they're still given the military, economic and humanitarian support from the West. It shows from a Russian perspective that they're still in business. I've said often that the Russian philosophy is the chicken pecks grain by grain, and they still believe that they are winning, and they're stuck in this sunk cost fallacy where they can't get out of the invasion that they started, the 3 to 5 day thunder run. They don't know really how to end it. They've not really achieved any of their strategic objectives, so they have this real dilemma of how do you end that? And they're really sending a message to both their own people, and that's what we saw with really Lavrov in the UN General Assembly last week, sort of saying that NATO and the EU was at war with Russia, i.e. Ukraine was a proxy body for NATO. That is obviously, from a Western perspective, absolute nonsense, because there are no Western boots on the ground, neither have any Western troops been killed. But that is the narrative and framing bias that the Russians want to sell to their own people, because that also allows the Russians to endure, to try and keep their will at a high level, when at the moment they're increasingly taking greater cost to their oil infrastructure, particularly their refining capacity. And that can be really crucial for the future. If you go back to Senator John McCain's sort of line that Russia is no more than a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. So it could be that Lavrov is also sort of making the Russian people aware that there might be a period where they have to turn inwards and live in a way which is not the way they might expect in sort of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Is that a risk? Now, we don't really know because one of the things for Russians is that don't ever mistake a tight grip for a stable grip, and the words of Sir Richard Moore. But also, he was doing a co-location with Bill Burns, the CIA chief, a year ago. Burns then saw no evidence that Putin's grip on power was weakening. Neither do I think we, at the moment, a year later, see any evidence that Putin's grip on power is weakening. So you can overplay the damage to the oil infrastructure, not because it is not real, but it's really going back to what Prigozhin said before he died, that Russia might have to be prepared to live like North Korea for a few years. So whether the Russian people would be prepared to do that if they believed that Russia absolutely was at war with NATO.
Indeed, and you say we shouldn't overplay that, but the impact is really starting to become noticeable of the Ukrainian long range strikes. I mean, Russia is now saying it's halting its diesel exports for the rest of the year because of shortages, and we've heard that there are also shortages in Moscow for people trying to refuel their cars. You know, as a battlefield commander, hearing there are shortages like that, that's got to be at least concerning because, it's diesel, which is used to power a lot of the Russian military, presumably.
Yeah, and may be that there comes to be a choice between providing the petrol, oil, and lubricants to the military or providing it to the civilians. I don't want to give the impression that I'm underplaying it. I think what can be overplayed is the imminency of collapse. So, for example, in 2011, 2012, when I was working alongside the Americans at a high level, every economic indicator and military indicator in Syria, for example, was blinking red. Syria was on the point of imminent collapse. And of course, it took another 12 years for that to occur. So a lot of countries can endure a lot of heartache for a long time. So it's that which is the imponderable. We always say, in terms of the military, when operations start, that one of the variables is how will people fight? How long will they fight? And will they be able to endure that? That is absolutely the same for the civilian people. Can the civilians endure? For how long will they endure? And when is the point beyond which they won't endure? That is when you potentially get a kind of uprising or we won't do this anymore, which is a potential point of collapse for Putin. But again, I don't think we're seeing that at the moment. If it is a hard winter, you might see that in the future. But in 2025, I think that Putin is still secure this year, certainly.
And in terms of the impact of those strikes by Russia on Ukraine, especially these ones on Kiev, it's actually being felt on the world stage a little bit in that it seems to have swayed Trump perhaps more onto Ukraine's side. I mean, we're now hearing that the US might be prepared to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. How crucial could that be? Because that's quite an advanced weapon system, isn't it?
It is. Well, I think one of the first things we have to understand is that 60% of weapons being used on the battlefield now are indigenously produced by Ukraine. And Ukraine's ability to have expanded the deep battle in terms of their own weaponry has been extreme. So one of the strikes overnight was by the Neptune cruise missile, a Ukrainian missile, which was converted from a naval missile into a land missile. We've also heard rumours of the Flamingo, which can fly potentially in testing up to 3,000 kilometres. So they're expanding the envelope, which is what has allowed them to take out something like 13 out of the 40 of the Russian oil refineries. The crucial thing about Tomahawk and actually the German Taurus missile is their ability to evade electronic jamming and their sophistication, which means that there's a circular error of probability. Hitting a target where you want to hit a target at long range is there for the future. I don't think Trump has at the moment had a sort of Damascene moment of unequivocal support for Ukraine. I think he's really in the business of sell, baby, sell. That is, that the Americans aren't giving support for in large S terms anymore. They're selling weapons to NATO, which will sell them on to Ukraine, which is sort of consistent with this mercantilist approach of Trump to foreign policy. So I don't think that we can see yet an enabled policy of Trump which says I'm all in with Ukraine. For example, at the moment, one of the things we might have been expecting tomorrow is for the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 to be an addition to the supplemental bill, which will have to pass to give funding for the US government, at least for the next few months, if not for the fiscal year in America. I don't think that's going to happen at the moment. It was first mooted that that would happen in July. Certainly, hawks in the American system, such as Lindsey Graham, expected that to happen. It is a bipartisan bill between Blumenthal from the Democrats and Lindsey Graham. At some stage, you may have this spat between the legislature and the executive in terms of the legislature saying, come on, the executive, we need to get on with this. So at the moment, there does seem to be still a bit of foot dragging from Trump on unequivocal support for Ukraine. That is, he's consistently kicking the can down the road on that, in the way that Putin is also kicking down the can down the road on any form of serious negotiations, either via a bilateral or trilateral. And he's certainly not in the business of going for a ceasefire, which he sees as a precondition.
Yeah, well, if the war is still a long way away for the Americans, it's not so much for Europe anymore. We've seen yet more concerning things. Poland over the weekend having to activate its air force because of strikes into Ukraine, very far west. On top of that, Denmark has now says it's going to ban all drone flights after a series of drones were flying over military bases there. What should we make of this, again, sort of what we were calling sub-threshold attacks by seemingly Russian forces in Europe?
Well, I think what's interesting is to go back a few years because, of course, in 2015, Turkey shot down an Su-24M in its airspace when there was a violation by Russia over the border from Syria, when Russia had gone all in with supporting Assad at that time. Now, of course, one of the things which the Ukraine war has shown us is that Russia's power is not ubiquitous. That's why they couldn't support Assad in the final denouement and were left to be seen to be a paper tiger, the phrase which Trump used last week. But I think what's interesting on that is that although the Turks shot down a Russian aircraft, there had been a series of violations in October 2015 by the Russians, of which on the third time the Turks called in the Russian ambassador. What I might expect to see, because we've now had incursions recently into Romania, potentially Denmark, although Russia was not named, alongside Estonian airspace, is you might see a coordinated diplomatic move in NATO to call in the Russian ambassador in those sovereign countries, so that you've got that coordinated action. And I think the other two things which we've seen are one of the things that Putin is seeking to do by this is to stress test NATO and to see what their collective will is. The first thing you'd say is that having stood up NATO very quickly after the Poland operation, an operation called Operation Eastern Sentry, which is both more aircraft, more surveillance, more radars, and more ground-based air defence, that is a positive thing, quickly done. And this week we've got significant EU meetings in Denmark, and Denmark is also going to receive troops before that meeting on Thursday, I think, both from Germany, France, and Sweden. That's radar, anti-drone capabilities. So I think everything that Putin tries to do seems to go against him. So at the moment, looking at the collective will of NATO, the thing he's trying to break, it only seems to make it stronger. There are interesting peripherals on this of all the countries involved. So, for example, the incursion into Estonian airspace. Estonia don't have any of their own fast fighter jets, so they rely on forward deployed NATO capability. Therefore, the decision to engage in Estonian airspace would be for NATO to take, in the way that it wasn't, for example, in Turkey, where airspace is sovereign in peacetime under the Chicago Convention, but Turkey took its own sovereign decision to shoot down a Russian aircraft, but was supported by NATO very, very quickly, in the same way that Poland, Denmark, Romania have also been supported very, very quickly. So I think at the moment, I would say that the plus side of the ledger is with NATO, how they've reacted, not with Russia, which looks to be in the minus category on the ledger.
And as part of these supposed Russian incursions, Kiev is claiming that Moscow is now launching drones from Shadow Fleet tankers. Obviously, we've seen operations like that, Operation Spiderweb, before, where where drones were launched from trucks. How seriously do you think commanders in Europe are going to be taking that threat? The idea that Russia could bring in a weapon system like a drone using a tanker?
Well, I think they should. It's really to do with either Schengen or the open borders and what level of checking you have and how your intelligence goes. So I don't think there should be any complacency on this. I think what's interesting on the Denmark side is that there's actually a air defence surveillance frigate going to surveil Danish airspace. So one of the potential things that happened was a Russian ship launching drones. That would be picked up, it seems to me, by the German capability. I think it's the FSG Hamburg is the platform which the Germans have put to secure that part of the Danish airspace for the duration of this week at least.
And how should Europe be going about countering drones? I mean, we're now hearing that Ukrainian soldiers could end up training Polish soldiers on how to, shoot down drones using interceptor drones and things like that. Is Ukraine now, because of its experience in this conflict, one of the only European countries that has a real and tested anti-drone system, rather than having to rely on more traditional things like very expensive jets?
Well, the speed of innovation is the thing we've been looking at the last few years. And it's where the speed of innovation comes from both the Ukrainian side and actually from the civil sector, which has been supporting Ukraine and how that's been working. So, from a UK perspective, for example, we've had the UK task force Kindred, which has been providing the bulk of our support via the Ramstein format to coordinate the support to them. But we had this thing announced a few weeks ago, Project Octopus from the Brits, which is a sort of anti-drone capability to drone hunt in terms of the Shaheeds. But one of the things we're also seeing is the commercialization of the battle space. So, for example, one of the capabilities given to the Ukrainians is under a program called White Stork being the Ukrainian national bird. That has been a program which was actually stood up via Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who's looking at using AI incorporated into anti-drone technology to hunt Shaheeds. So it's not just the fact that it's Ukraine doing this; they are being given pretty decent capability. But like all these things, the people who operate them in a combat situation are probably the people to go through to train other people. They have the realities of this on a day-to-day basis, in the way that the armies of the West, who obviously aren't fighting because deterrence still works at the moment, don't have that sort of qualitative and quantitative data that people on the ground do.
And to bring this back to Ukraine and the battle on the front, Chip, I'm keen to discuss Ukraine's adoption of the core system from its older brigade system. And I'd like to discuss a couple of specific examples of where the core system seems to have had some successes. The Times' Maxim Tucker wrote an article late last week about how first Azov Corps was able to encircle a Russian attack north of Pokrovsk when it got ahead of its support forces of artillery and drones. There are 3,000 Russian casualties there, hundreds of Russian troops now encircled and cut off from the rest of the Russian army. That's a sort of warfare that Maxim certainly described as us not really having seen since the start of this war, when we saw those quite significant retaking of land from Russia. How crucial is that kind of operation and that mobility in a war like this?
Well, I think firstly we have to look at organisational structures and then functions. So, um, in UK terms and NATO terms, as a corps is a certain size. So you would have battalions, brigades, divisions, and corps. Corps being a number of divisions which have capabilities to fight just both a close battle next 24 hours and a deep battle that out to 72 hours. It's different in size terms in the Ukrainians. So a corps would be really the sort of size of a brigade, but you'd expect it to have all arms capabilities. Now that also is changing in terms of the sort of sword versus shield, and it's both the drones and deep range fires, artillery, working together with air defense above that and electronic warfare. But the key thing is not really the platforms you have to fight in an all arms way, it's the method of fighting. So the fact that they're not going for attritional head on warfare against the Russians, but using the sort of little heart philosophy of encirclement, break things up into small groups. It is that which psychologically unhinges the enemy. It's the equivalent of the British mission command and maneuver warfare, telling someone what to do, not how to do it, and they'll always surprise you with their ingenuity. It's trying to find a flank and exploit that. It is not head on warfare. So, what you want from a force is unity of effort and decentralization. And I think that's what the Ukrainians have had, along with their unity of purpose. They know what they're there for, what they're required to do. Fighting on sovereign territory also gives you a bit of a fillip more than someone who's the invader. So, historically, we'll have said in the last 2.5 to 3 years that the Ukrainians have been pretty slow to adopt this sort of decentralization, which is a thing where people use their initiative to overcome these problems rather than a very regimented Soviet sort of system. But they're getting better at it. They've been forced into innovation, not just in command terms, but in terms of using the capabilities that are given to them. And both of those are a learning process, which they seem to be doing quite well. Let's just put one caveat on that, though, and that is that there is still no operational breakthrough from the Ukrainian side. It's easy to chew up small formations, and worth saying that really the original currency of the Russians in 2022 was the battalion tactical group, an all arms grouping. That has been shot to bits by the equipment losses in the last 3 years, and we're having what has been termed to be motorcide, when you're having absolutely horrific casualties on those who are trying to do offensive operations with motorbikes and quad bikes. That is not really a military capability which is going to lead you to go towards an exploitation echelon in the way that we used to talk about operational maneuver groups in the grand old days of Three Shock Army and British Army of the Rhine.
Well, Chip Chapman, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.